Lynn, the first question, which I think that you have obviously answered, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it comes from a member of the Italian Parliament, and the person is not only a member of the Parliament, but is the leader of the Lega Nord delegation. And the question is, hello, Mr. LaRouche. I'd like to take this opportunity of today's video conference to bring to your attention a few questions. The investigation report on the U.S. financial crisis, known as the Angelides Report, notes that the causes of the crisis, namely the lack of ethics in the financial market, the lack of effective controls, and the reckless power of financial institutions, have still not been corrected. Do you agree with these conclusions, and do you expect that there will be corrections? Also, in light of the scandalous decision yesterday in Italy, in which 4 major banks, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Citibank, and Deutsche Bank, all involved in the sale of Parmalat bonds, were acquitted of the crime of rigging the market, do you believe that a return to Glass-Steagall in the United States, and with it a division between financial assets and savings, will give us some progress in resolving these sorts of problems?
Well, as you probably know by now, yes. But there's more to it in the sense that I had a report from Helga yesterday on which he actually is in our system. It's an oral report which she gave as a part of her weekly report function to the organization in Germany and to Europe generally. And it's quite a shocking list of facts of what's going on there now. The obvious thing which I conclude from that sort of thing is that without an initiative from the United States, nothing can be done effectively in Europe. Let me just sum this up briefly because our questioner from Italy knows this also. But it has to be emphasized as a policy question, not just an answer to the question. It's what's the policy here? Europe had reached the point of recovery in the end of 1989, beginning of 1990, with the collapse of the East Germany Democratic Republic. Chain reaction collapse. This opened the way immediately, obviously, for the reunification of Germany because the fall of the DDR government had been caused by, well, Gorbachev, for example. Mikhail Gorbachev was a key factor in this and his policies, but also other policies, the policies of Gorbachev's, one of his predecessors, Andropov, who had these British orientation. Gorbachev still has it today. Andropov and Gorbachev were both closely tied and I would say controlled by British imperial influences. Their mismanagement of the situation in Eastern Europe, not only in the DDR, the East Germany, but more broadly, created a crisis situation which I had foreseen in my studies, which were in my proposal for the SDI. The purpose of my pushing the SDI, which was started actually by me entirely. It started in 1977, the summer and fall of 1977. And I resolved that this was the crucial thing. I remember I'd run for president before. I understood what was being done by certain circles in the United States and Britain. And I said, we've got to avoid these horror shows. We cannot worry about trying to settle accounts with the Soviet Union as a so-called adversary. This is a losing game. What we have to do is take a step-by-step approach. Instead of turning conflict into cooperation, if we can get cooperation with the Soviet system on this, with the United States and some European nations, we could solve this problem. That is, by a change in direction of economic cooperation, which would eliminate the whole damn threat. And by taking that step would open the doors for further adjustments, which would bring the relation of the transatlantic relations and others back into some kind of sensible kind of thing that Roosevelt would have approved of. Because sometimes you cannot make a perfect design for paradise. Paradise may be popular, but it's slow in arriving. And sometimes, waiting for it to be delivered, you fail to do the job of delivering it yourself, which may take a couple of generations. So that was my purpose. I was able to enlist leading circles in Europe and the United States in support of this idea. And this was advanced rapidly once we had the then current president out of office. So we had leading circles in France of leading generals. They were officially mostly with retired generals, the top-ranking retired generals, top-ranking retired Italian generals, a whole group of top-ranking German military officials, and others, not just military alone, but military was crucial, because in order to deal with a reform of a military conflict, you have to engage a representation of military interests among the relevant nations. So we had among U.S. intelligence services, part of it, U.S. military, part of it, particularly older people like me, and people who were older than I was at the time. And we had this agreement. Italian generals, among others, were part of this. Italian officials were part of it. We had a solid design, a workable design for a new negotiation with, among others, the Soviet Union. It had to be essentially a Western European-wide basis for agreement. The Soviet system in general, until prior to Andropov's entry, the Soviets are among the key elements which I was negotiating with, the diplomatic channels and related channels. So we had a package. No, this was killed by the British interests. Then, as a result of the Andropov administration, but especially the Gorbachev administration, which was a terrible mess, and it was largely tied to British interests. So you had a whole section, a part of the old Soviet system, which were more British than they were Russian. And this was, Gorbachev is typical of that. The YALSA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, is another one of these crummy organizations of that type. So you had rotten elements in the Soviet system, from morally rotten elements, as you had in the United States and other countries. But the point was, we were hoped to bypass some of these rotten elements by a fait accompli, that is, by actually getting an agreement which leading people in these countries would simultaneously agree to. We had reached that point where that was possible by 1983. So what happened then, of course, is the failure, which I saw that if we did not get this kind of agreement early in the 1980s, we were going to face a terrible outcome worldwide by the end of the decade. And that's what happened. But in any case, we have a remnant of that, which is the useful remnant. That was a lesson to be learned. We goofed. We had in our hands leading circles, military, intelligence, and so forth, among leading nations across the Atlantic and other parts of Japan, etc. We had an agreement, in principle, which would have avoided most of the terrible crap that's gone on since that time. It was turned down under British influence. And what it was done instead in 1989 and 1990 was that a dictatorship was imposed upon Europe. Instead of, as Chancellor Kohl at that time had intended, instead of having the reunification of Germany, where you had the whole citizenry of former East Germany was coming over to unite with the United Germany. And you had the chance of doing that. So instead of that, you had the assassination by a leading nation of Europe of the key economic figure in Kohl's entourage. And the assassination of this person demoralized Kohl into submitting to a dictatorship imposed by George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, by Mitterrand, François Mitterrand of France, and by, of course, the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. This set into motion a scheme called the Euro system. The Euro system was an intention of turning all of Europe, continental Europe, into a bad bank. Now, here's where the bad bank. Now, the bad bank is the basis for the present Euro system. That is, that agreement, which was imposed in the period of 89-90 by Mitterrand, Thatcher, and Bush, and others, but these are the principles. That system created a breakdown of the entire economic system that set into motion policies that did that, as we knew were coming, over the period up to the present time. What they did in instituting the euro during the past decade, what they did was to turn all of the economy of Europe, especially Central and Western Europe, continental Europe, into a bad bank. A similar thing was done with other parts of the world in Asia through what's called the BRIC. The same thing was done from the inside the United States with the Federal Reserve System. So what they did, you've got three categories and others of bad banks. The BRIC, the Euro, and the Federal Reserve System. These are banks which are intended to go bankrupt. They're intended to bring down the nations which are directed to go bankrupt. The United States, China, Russia, Brazil, and so forth, and continental Europe are all intended to go down. How do you do it? You're now on the verge, right now, in this moment, you're on the verge of this becoming realized. You have now a hyperinflationary explosion has taken off like a rocket in Europe and in the United States. You're going to find a surge in devaluation of the currency systems of those nations. There's going to be a question of rewriting the financial systems and banking systems of those nations. And it's going to go down like Germany, 1923. Germany, October, November, 1923. And what happened then in 23 is what is planned now. That each of these systems, which are scheduled for bad bank treatment, what do you do with a bad bank? You close it down. In other words, you try to save your part of your system that you want to control by bankrupting and shutting down the other part of the system. So you take all the unpayable debts of the world, or most of them, and you wipe them out. How? By eliminating the nations, or eliminating their financial systems with a bad bank treatment. Now, this is what's happening. This is the issue. You have a system of bad banks, including the Federal Reserve System. Look at its debt. It's a bad bank. And you have the financial chief of the Obama administration as part of the same operation. What's the intention? The intention is by the British Empire, by the Queen of England et al., to sink the United States, Europe, and the areas of the BRIC. Wipe them out financially, the way Germany was crushed with the inflation in 1923. And Italy, of course, is on that list. That's the answer you've got to get. Therefore, the only solution, is to do what I prescribed. We take care of that. We decide who the bad bank is. How do we make the decision? By the nations that agree to this kind of agreement, to reorganization of the system. Simply, Glass-Steagall and reenactment of President Roosevelt's fixed exchange rate system. Those two measures will define the participating nations as the surviving nations. It will define those who are behind the bad bank scheme, conspiracy, which are largely London, Manhattan, and so forth. Those systems will face a certain degree of embarrassment, of lack of riches. And that's the way it has to be done. So that really is the answer I think you really would like to have.